What's up, YouTube? I'm MoneyJ2K with GTO Wizard, and I'm back with another LLinusLLove hand review. This one was a $10,000 pot at $25.50, and it's got some fireworks on the river. Alright, so the hand starts out with us opening the button with 10-7 of hearts to $126. The big blind calls. The big blind is born to tilt. He's a very respectable 25-50 pro. He's been on Joey Ingram's podcast. He's definitely someone to look out for. Flop is queen, queen, 8 rainbow. Big blind's not going to have any donks, so born to tilt range checks. Linus is going to be betting range here, betting about 1/3. Linus does. Born to tilt calls. Turn is the ace of diamonds. A pretty equal turn. Both players are going to have some trips. Both players are going to have some 8x. Both players are going to have some ace-x. Born to tilt checks. Linus checks backs. He's got 10 high. I think this could mix in some bets just because we're going to want to be bluffing this turn quite a lot because we're going to have a lot of trips. We're going to have a lot of ace-x and whatnot. River's the king of clubs. Born to tilt puts in a 2x overbet. Linus ships it for $3,725 more. And Born to tilt calls. Born to tilt has jack 10 off. So obviously a pretty standard play from Born to tilt. However, Linus's play is quite interesting. He's got the 10 blocker, but we're not quite sure what our best bluffs are going to be here. Hearts are probably good, but this is what we got GTO Wizard for. So let's jump in. So now that we're in GTO Wizard, we can start to analyze how the ranges interact. So just as a reminder, this is button versus big blind, single raise pot. Flop is queen, queen, 8 rainbow. Going to the equity graph, we can pretty quickly see that the button has a pretty drastic advantage all the way across from the bottom end all the way up to the very top end. However, the top end of the ranges actually become very close. Both players have quite a lot of trips. So the overall trip counts, the button is going to have slightly more, as you can see, but the big blind definitely has a lot of trips. So this is going to be one of those interesting flops where the big blind actually has pretty close equity at the top end of the ranges. However, the big blind is still losing pretty drastically at the bottom end of the ranges. The big part where the button's overall range advantage comes from is going to come from basically full house, quads, over pairs, and under pairs. If we look at just these combos, the button has 7.2%, whereas the big blind has none. And so basically what that means is that's right here on the equity graph. That's where this largest differential is between the button and the big blind's ranges. And you can see where this is a very drastic advantage. The big blind just doesn't have these hands. Big blind really doesn't have that many boats either, like pocket 8s and queen 8. And so what this results in is when we go to the strategy tab, we see that the button bets his entire range. Button's betting 94% of the time. He mixes in some of these larger sizes, but I think as human players, we can simplify this to just range betting for a third pot and not lose any EV. So once we go here, we put in the 27% bet. The big blind is playing quite mixed here. So the big blind's going to be mixing in a lot of these trip hands between raising and calling, and a lot of these 8x hands are also going to be, whereas ace 8 is raising the most, obviously, and going down, the 8x is going progressively down, raising less and less. It is going to be really, really merged. We're going to see bluffs like pocket 2s and pocket 3s and 9-7 and 9-6 and jack 9 and 10-9 and jack 10 and king 10. There's a lot of different bluffs here, and it's going to be very, very merged. One of the things to note is when we filter for the folding range, it's actually a lot. It's actually very important when we go to these later streets that these low end hands get folded, because if we go to the button strategy here, the button still has all of these very low equity hands, whereas the big blind got to fold all of those on the flop. So once we start looking at the turns and the rivers, it's going to be really interesting how that's going to interact. So let's go to a turn. Big blind calls. Turn is the ace of diamonds. And so the big blind is checking range here. He's not going to be donking very much. And the reason the big blind's not going to be donking is fairly intuitive. The equity actually runs very, very close on this board. And so the big blind is going to have to balance his checking range quite a lot here. And so on the turn, we can start to see trips. Now the big blind is actually at a slight advantage in trips. This is mainly because the big blind's number of combos went down. So as a general density of his range, the trips has become a higher density. That's why he only has 13 combos of trips. However, it's 10.3% of his total range. Now, this is just because the big blind's range got split up on the flop. So the big blind may have folded some of these some combos, he raised some combos, and so now the overall combos that the big blind has is drastically less than what he had on the flop. So now he may have a higher density of trips overall. And another thing to note in the trips area is the button has some of the higher trips. He has some of the king queen suited, the queen jack suited as well, where the queen jack off, and the big blind doesn't have as many of these. The big blind is mainly having these lower queen X because these higher queen X raise the flop. And so when we go over to the strategy tab, we can really start to see that the button is mixing quite a lot here. Again, the button is betting roughly 60% of the time. The button is not over betting, and that just comes down to this equity graph again, where the top end of the equity graph is actually pretty close. So we don't have this really large nut advantage, and so we're not going to be wanting to overbet and trying to really push a nut advantage because our nut advantage just doesn't exist. And so when we put in when we put in the check, river the king of clubs, and this is where the hand gets really interesting. And so the big blind's definitely using a lot of these overbets here. And that is mainly because his hands need to get some money in. Some of these really good hands like queen 2 and queen 3, hands like queen 8 suited, hands like king queen now, the low frequency that he has it, as well as the low frequency that he has pocket 8s. It's going to be really important for him to get money in the middle. And so when we filter for this overbet range, we can see it's a lot of these trip hands, a lot of these these boats as well. So these hands really need to get the money in, like I said. And so he definitely is going to want to have an overbet range. It's also important to note that he has this smaller range. And this just goes back to the equity graph, where now if we look at the equity graph, the big blind actually has a pretty significant advantage now. The big blind has 54% equity, whereas the button has 46% equity. And we can see that it's pretty much an overall range advantage. The button has some spots and some points where he has an advantage, but for the most part, the big blind's going to be at an advantage. So what this means is he's going to have some hands that are able to go for thin value and some hands that are able to go for some really big value. So as we can see, his best hands, big blind has 39.2% of best hands, and the button has 23.6%. And so we can just see that the big blind now that the button split his turn range between bets and checks, now the button is now significantly weaker on the river. And now the big blind moves, the advantage moves towards the big blind. So the big blind can now have a pretty high bet frequency. As we go back to the strategy tab, big blind is overall betting 50% of the time, but he's mixing in some of these pretty large overbets as well. And so once the big blind puts in this overbet, now the button spot gets quite interesting. And so the button actually does have a good chunk of boats here. So the button has aces and kings. He also has queen 8. He has ace queen. He has king queen. He has ace queen as well. It also has a very, very low frequency of pocket 8s. Now that means that he's going to want to have a jamming range. Now the button is only calling 40% of the time, or only defending 40% of the time. And his calls are a lot of bluff catching kind of calls. So he's calling some of these ace-x and whatnot as total bluff catchers. He's calling even some 8x as total bluff catchers, just because the big blind is mainly not going to be bluffing. He's not going to be bluffing any pairs. And so Jack 8 is going to beat all the bluffs and is going to lose to all the value. So that makes Jack 8 an exact kind of bluff catcher. He also has a Jack, so the Jack is blocking hands like Jack 10. And so he makes an even better bluff catcher. And then these ace-x have very similar properties where they beat all of the bluffs but lose to all the value. And all of these trips, these lower end trips, are also going to mix between raising and calling. These are just marginally good enough to raise, but also good enough to call. They're not getting called by a lot worse when they raise, and they're winning a lot when they do call. So they can mix between both. And now once we start looking at our bluffs, we can start seeing the highest frequency bluffs are 10s and jacks actually. And so 10s and jacks makes the most sense because when we go back to the big blind's range, the big blind really didn't have that many boats. He only has he only has 0.6% of his range is boats. However, a lot of his range is straights. And when we filter by the overbet, by the overbet, we can see that Jack 10 is the best hand in that range. And a lot of these trips end up folding when we jam over the top. So these trips are actually not too bad for him to have when we're looking at it from the buttons perspective. And so the main thing that we want to block is Jack 10, because he doesn't have very many boats. And so we don't want to be blocking we don't want to have an 8 or an ace or a king, just because he doesn't really have pocket 8s. He doesn't really have queen 8 suited very much. He doesn't really have any of these hands. So having a pair when we're choosing these bluffs isn't really going to be necessary. We're going to want to double block the straight, because that's going to be the main part of his calling range. So pocket jacks and pocket 10s are going to be the best bluffs. Now we get to some of these mixed frequency kind of bluffs here. So we start getting to our exact hand, 10-7 of hearts. And this is what makes Linus really interesting and really good at what he does. This is a very low frequency raise. However, it is a raise. And so we don't really know whether Linus is RNGing the spot, how he's playing the spot overall. Maybe he's over bluffing the spot. Maybe he's under bluffing the spot. Maybe he rolled 100 and he was only going to bluff this 1 out of 100 times, but this time he decided to RNG it and he got there. But the fact of the matter is 10-7 of hearts is a bluff. May only be 7% of the time. However, it's a bluff. So why is 10-7 of hearts chosen over 10-7 of spades and 10-7 of clubs? Mainly, this is because when we go back to the flop, he's calling a lot of these backdoor flush draws. So he's calling a lot of double spade draws. He's calling double diamonds, double clubs, and he's not going to be calling 10-7 of hearts. The other reason this is he's going to have some queen 10 of hearts, and the 10 of hearts blocks a couple extra combos of trips where he can't have queen X of spades. He can't have queen diamonds of spades, but he can have some queen heart X. So blocking queen 10 of hearts as well as queen 7 of hearts can be a pretty good thing, especially because a lot of the queen 10 might be calling at some frequency. So we're blocking some calling ranges. So overall, hearts are going to be greatly preferred over clubs, diamonds, and spades, just because they unblock the backdoor flush draws. And remember, we check back the turn. So all of these backdoor flush draws that called the flop, they're still in the big blind's range. So he's still going to have all these backdoor flush draws that get to fold the river. And he might be putting some of these backdoor flush draws into the overbet range as mixing in some of these bluffs. And so some of the other hands that are low frequency bluffs, hands like Jack 4, hands like Jack 5, but mainly the heart combos. The club combos are very small, low frequency as well, but mainly all of these hands are going to be using the heart combos. And so overall, the button is mainly going to be wanting to have a jack or a 10 because it wants to bet jack. It wants to block Jack 10 and it wants to block the straights. And so the primary bluff is going to be pocket jacks and pocket 10s. And so once we put in the all in, now the big blind actually plays quite nitty here. And so as we can see, the big blind is folding a lot of trips. He's folding most of his trips, actually. About 77% of his trips are folding here. And that's mainly because all these trips are bluff catchers. When we go back to the button's range, he's not really betting these low trips very often. The main part of his range is boats, ace queen, and pocket kings and pocket aces, as well as these higher trips like queen jack and queen 10. And so these low these low queen X are actually pretty much pure bluff catchers. They're not beating a lot of value, especially when you have the queen. It's very, very unlikely that your opponent has that last queen in the deck. It's much more likely that your opponent has pocket aces or pocket kings or pocket eights. And so you end up running into a boat slightly more often than you really should in the overall range just because of your blocker effects. Now, the big blind's primary part of his calling range is going to be these boats, queen 8, pocket 8s, king queen, and jack 10. Now, jack 10 is obviously the hand that we were trying to block the most and the hand that Born to Tilt had, so he calls. So in conclusion, the primary part for the button's range is he wants to be bluffing pocket jacks, he wants to be bluffing pocket 10s because he wants to block jack 10. The button also wants to have hearts because he unblocks some of those backdoor flush draws. And some of the best things we can learn from these kind of spots is starting to understand what we need to think about when we're in game and trying to choose our best bluffs. The most important thing is realizing that all of these hands were lower frequency bluffs. Even pocket jacks and pocket tens weren't pure bluffing. Even our best bluffs were only betting roughly 27 to 50% of the time. You need to make sure that you're RNGing these spots, because it's going to be really important that you don't just send every single potential bluff. You can also see all these lower frequency bluffs were less than 5% or so. And so I think the best thing that we can all learn from these kind of spots is understanding the principles in what kind of blockers we want, when we want which blockers, which suits are the best. And we can really use programs like GTO Wizard in order to start to understand and get a large sample size on a lot of different river jam spots and river bluff raises and whatnot. And so hopefully this video is really helpful. Leave a like. I'm going to be doing these videos hopefully every week. We're also going to be doing some GTO theory videos as well, so look out for those. Thank you.